These Lego blocks do not play nice, an uncommon way of phishing.
So, David, you've got a story here that has to do with phishing and sort of building a phishing kit that evades detection by putting pieces together from different sources. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's true. Yeah. So basically, it's not really a new or novel approach to phishing, but it is a new way how they're using code blocks to target Microsoft Office 365 credentials. So basically, what it is they have a standard email. Comes in with an actual document attached. That document looks like an Excel document, but it's actually an HTML document. And within that HTML document, they have embedded or URL encoding and entity encoding, which basically points to a URL at yourjavascript.com. And there's two URLs actually at yourjavascript.com, which are basically JavaScript files, which contain the actual malicious code itself, or the HTML code and the malicious code. So yourjavascript.com, I think, is a repository for just JavaScript libraries or things we put out there that isn't necessarily at the time was considered malicious. And I think in the past there have been some other phishing campaigns that did use that domain, but in this case, basically they're using it again, but twice. So once that particular HTML document is decoded and it makes the two calls to the JavaScript files at yourjavascript.com, it basically pieces those together. So that's kind of why they're calling it a Lego block. So blocks of code in chunks. So the first part is basically the HTML body, or the beginning of the HTML. The second part is the JavaScript function that actually does a little bit of validation on the username and password that's popped up in the actual Microsoft Office 365 login page. And then third being the actual HTML body. The fourth part is another pop-up messages that just ask you to re-log in. So basically you'll put your credentials in at that point. It's kind of like a fake standard one just to force someone to re-enter their valid credentials. And then the fifth part is in the original document that came on the email, that kind of rounds out the final HTML part. So based upon that stacking of that, they're basically calling that, like I say, Lego blocks. And the unique thing about it is not that, again, it's such a novel approach to phishing, because, phishing, as we all know, has been around for a while now, but it's the fact that they're remotely calling out and then piecing, so getting the pieces of code remotely and then piecing it together locally to show that login page. Whereas before, you'd get sent a one page by itself. You could actually have, your filtering or software could catch that, or you'd be redirected to a website itself. Now they're actually piecing that locally and creating that locally to get those login credentials. So that's kind of the uncommon thing about it, is the fact that how they're doing it now to remotely call that and build it instead of just all at once like we've seen in the past.
There's some clever tricks here. I'm looking at the article from TrustWave, and hiding the actual file extension is an interesting little trick here.
Right.
And then putting together the actual code from the disparate sources. That's pretty cool. That's pretty interesting.
Because again, it's not that no one hasn't done some of that in other type of attacks, but just because now that it has been doing it this way, so it's a new, and they're, like they say there at TrustWave, I think it was uncommon, just the fact that how they're actually piecing together instead of, again, like I mentioned earlier, is, all in one at the beginning. Now it's in sections or chunks, and then it gets pieced together on the local, system as you open that up. So that's kind of the somewhat novel approach to it. Not that it's an overall grand, whole new way of phishing, but just in this case, that's why they find it pretty interesting in how they're being done now.
I also like reading about the fact that TrustWave was doing all of their analysis just using Cyberchef, which, if viewers aren't familiar with it, it's an open source tool that I think GCHQ put out that lets you do a bunch of very common, almost like using Lego blocks to decode Lego blocks. The tool allows you to grab a bunch of very common operations, base64 encode, decode, URL code, encode, decode, cryptographic operations, and then just sort of drop them in one after the other to decode stuff that's encoded. I found it very helpful.
From an email security perspective, with these various blocks that you were talking about, David, it would appear that a good way of detecting this coming inbound would be to sandbox the actual attachments and then look from a forensics perspective of the communication happening and flagging it as suspicious because it's reaching out and it's doing all of these different things. instead of, as you stated, the old school phishing pages where, it looks like it's a lot. It's very complex. There's a lot of complexity to it, but unless you're doing specific things per message coming in, this could really obscure some filters that are sitting out there. So from an email security perspective, I find this to be extremely interesting and something that's going to be more difficult than standard phishing events that you and I see on a daily basis. So this is definitely a very interesting article. I would like to dive a lot deeper into it at a later time.
Well, yeah, I agree, right? And that's what it says. It's basically that is the point of it, to evade those defenses, because again, usually you'll see a whole chunk or piece of, let's say, an HTML or JavaScript, whereas this is, partial. So, unless there's some way we can actually see that an actual document is not, other than first, initially, if you find out the domain's bad, blocking that, right, obviously, but there's a way you can tell that if an incoming piece of document is not fully complete, maybe has an ending HTML, starting ending, or a JavaScript starting ending. I mean, I know that'd be a little complex to try that. There is going to have to be another approach or thought, as you say, Tony, to come up with a way to try to identify this, just because of the chunks, as you and Matt have both alluded to, the fact that those chunks are in pieces and don't really signify or let signature capture or identification know that it's truly malicious. Mm-hmm. So definitely, as you say, it's definitely something to have to look into and further investigate the best way to mitigate that.
Years ago, I did do a little bit of work in looking at phishing attacks, and one of the things that always frustrated me was that you could try and write automated tools to go and look at websites or even open up things like this that contain JavaScript, and JavaScript was always the trickiest part, because you basically had to be able to run the code in order to get it to do the things you wanted to, and phishing kits would fail to operate if you didn't have that one JavaScript component that absolutely had to run. So I know there are products today and systems and probably open source solutions that do that today, but it's very clever because you really do have to make sure it runs in a real browser that doesn't look hinky, that doesn't look like it's some sort of analysis engine. Because there's little things about the way that JavaScript runs that, like, if the code sometimes believes that it's being analyzed, it'll just drop out. And that was something I was only familiar with from an x86 binary standpoint. It's fascinating to see that malware is using JavaScript in this way. Phishing kits in particular, I think that counts as malware, to make it very difficult to analyze. And cutting it up is even a step beyond. And then, I don't know, this is exciting to look at for me. I always kind of like to see clever things, even though I realize they make everybody's job harder. I do like to see the clever attacks when they come to light.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes down to malware, not everything about malware is necessarily acting in a nefarious behavior. So if you take something like this and you chop it into pieces, it's going to look at those individual functions and say, this is fine, this is normal, this is fine, this is a little weird, this is fine, but you put it all together, mm-hmm. and it's something bad.